In this episode, I get to chat with bodybuilding competitor, historian, photographer, and videographer Wayne Gallasch. I've known Wayne for over 30 years, meeting him for the first time at his store when I purchased my first protein powder nearly 30 years ago. Now in his 70s, Wayne has been involved in competing, winning the Mr South Australia, and then moving on to become a renowned photographer and videographer of bodybuilders and bodybuilding contests. Wayne chats with me about the bodybuilding scene in South Australia in the 60s, seeing and filming Arnold at the NABBA Universe in 1970, where he won his last Mr Universe title, and we chat about the legends in the sport and the current pro scene. Wayne kept me enthralled for nearly 2 hours, reliving his stories from competitions around the world, including many Mr Olympia contests. This was a podcast I'd always wanted to do, and it does not disappoint. I hope you enjoy it too. With 52 years in the business behind him from 1965 to 2017, Wayne is now in his 53rd year in 2018. During this time, he has built up a massive archive of bodybuilding and fitness DVDs that is second to none. If you want vision of the newest faces and the biggest biceps in bodybuilding, Wayne has got them. Want to go backstage with the biggest names in the muscle game at the big events? Wayne will take you there. Visit gmv.com.au for the most extensive range in the world. All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Australian Muscle Talks 2. This, ever since I started this podcast, which is only now going into our 4th episode, by the way, I always said that one of the first people I wanted to talk to is this person. I've always had great chats with this gentleman and known him for a long time and do consider him a friend of mine. We have a history going back together a number of years, which we'll get to as we talk to. So, without any ado, I'd like to welcome Wayne Gallasch to our podcast.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Wayne. Thanks for welcoming me into your beautiful home here in the Adelaide Hills, even though it's a bit gloomy out there today, but
yeah, it is.
It's a spectacular position. I'll just quickly recap on a few things that I know about you. I did a bit of research, and it's amazing how well known you are known in the bodybuilding industry around the world. Everyone knows Wayne Gallasch if they're somehow involved in bodybuilding in a big way. But some of the other things that people don't know or might not know, and I didn't know either, is that you actually were a bodybuilding competitor and you won a South Australian title. You're a world record indoor row holder.
Yes.
That's correct.
World record holder in indoor rowing in the 500 metre sprint.
Yeah.
In the lightweight in my age class. Yeah.
You're considered as one of the best historians of bodybuilding in the world, which I very much agree with. You're a photographer, you're a videographer. Is there anything else that I missed?
That's pretty much that'll do. I started off in squash, where I won a few titles in squash, and that led me to go to the gym. So I joined a gym. That was the only reason I joined a gym. I wanted to be better at squash. So I joined a gym in 1962, and that gym happened to be Ross Davies' gym in Adelaide, down on the Anzac Highway, and it did improve my squash. And then in 1962 they had a gym competition for the best in the gym, best bodybuilder, and I happened to win that. And I thought, very narrowly, because there were a few other good guys there. And then from there I was pushed towards going in the Mr South Australia and the Mr Adelaide. So I did my first contest there, would have been the Mr Adelaide, and that would have been 1964.
Back then, was it a federation? Was it a NABBA show? Or?
Well, back then it had just become SABA, South Australian Bodybuilders Association, and that actually was incorporated, as far as I could see from my research, in 1964, which was this same year that I started competing. And prior to that, the first state contests were run by Ross Davies, the gym owner that happened to be where I was training, And then another year, I think it was 1963, Norm Harrison, who was a top competitor, he was the promoter of the Mr South Australia. And then in 1964, this South Australian committee formed called SABBA, and then I competed with them, and they were linked to the IFBB, and not many people would perhaps know that.
No, considering back then the IFBB would have been very a fledgling organisation.
In Australia, it was reasonably young, and it was run by Paul Graham, or I believe he was running it as early as that, and he's been running it to the present day as Australia's president. Although Toni Doherty, of course, has a very big say in matters in that area these days.
Yeah. Well, there's actually been a split there now.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah. So back then, what was it like competing? Like, what was the bodybuilding scene like?
Well, it was vibrant. We would all be training for the next contest, which would be 6 months away, which would be the Adelaide, as it is today. It would usually be in about March or April, and then the South Australia, which would typically be in September.
Yeah, which is pretty well the same as it is now.
It's hardly changed, but we only had those two big contests. There were no other federations that I can recall. The Naturals hadn't got going at that time, and so we all had our focus for these two shows a year. And then when it came to the Mr South Australia, I'll just pick a year, say it was about 1966. I can remember there were 26 in the lineup.
Yeah.
And it was like that most years, and they couldn't fit us all on the stage because you can't put 26 across in a line. So they had us 13 at a time, 13 at the back, then 13 at the front, and then they swapped it around.
So what was there, like now in a bodybuilding show, there's up to 50 divisions. How many divisions were in the South Australian titles in 1966?
I'm glad you asked me that. I would say two. There was the open class, which meant any height for the men, and masters, you were all in together, because I can remember guys competing against me 15 to 20 years older than me. There was no separate class for masters, and I recall there was a teenage class. So there were really only two sections of the competition, and that's why everybody was in this great big pot on stage called the open.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter about your height or your weight or your age. You were just judged on who was the best on the day.
Yeah. So you still did a routine and everything? Was that part of bodybuilding back then?
Yes, we did routines, but I don't recall there being music and cassettes. I think that came in somewhat later.
I think so too, and judging by some of I've been listening to John Hanson's podcast, and they talking with the people from back then, and the routines, I think, with music only came in maybe the late 60s or 70s, early 70s.
Probably early 70s, I would think, because I don't remember, I didn't have a cassette recorder back then, so I'm sure that the posing routines were silent.
Yeah.
And I can't remember anybody ever posing too long.
Yeah.
Because you had your standard poses that you were good at, you did the poses, and you left the stage.
Yeah. Was the judging was it done like it is today, where they called out there was mandatory poses, that sort of was in place then?
Yes, I would say it was similar to the old style of the NABBA judging, whereby you would all line up, round one, do quarter turns. Then I've got a feeling that we might have posed second, set like a second round, and then I think we were compared in groups. That was done last, because I think that's where the real decisions were made as to where you were going to place.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that came last, but it's such a simple question, it's hard to remember exactly what order that we did do that.
Yeah.
And then I seem to recall there'd be prejudging, say in the afternoon, and then you'd go back to the theatre or the venue, and you'd have the show finals at the night.
Yeah, yeah. Which is that kept going right up until I think
recent
the 2000s. Even my first IMBA show that I ran was as a pre-judging and a show. And it was a little bit after that then when he started coming in to the one show formats. So you won the South Australian title against what 20?
I'd say against 26 other people, and I can see from the past history that there were several times when I didn't quite get there. I was runner-up the year before to a guy who had a fantastic physique, very symmetrical. He had big arms and big calves, and that's a very good combination. It gives you good balance. And his name was Eddie Smolsky, and he was from the St. Clair gym. Yeah, it was called the youth centre, and he won it 4 times. So he won it 3 years in a row, 63 to 65. Then in 66, David Stroud from England was living in Adelaide, and he was the 1962 NABBA Mr Britain overall.
Oh,
and
right.
when we saw him in the backstage pump-up area, we all said to each other, well, he's first, who's going to be second, third and fourth? He was so outstanding. He had 19-inch arms and in shape, and I'd never seen arms like that here in Adelaide before. So he was just like from another planet. And then the next year, 67, Eddie Smolsky won it again, and the guest poser was Dave Draper.
Oh, right, yes.
And it was held in the Centennial Town Hall. Peter McNally was the promoter for that particular event, and Centennial Hall is gone now at Wayville. It's been knocked down, but the hall was packed out because Dave Draper was a movie star, and he'd just been making this movie, Don't Make Waves, and I think he'd been in another one as well, maybe Beach Party, I'm not sure, but he was a huge star, and Dave Draper presented the trophies and presented me with my second place trophy, and I was even more determined that next year I'd come back and win it, and I did manage to do that in 1968.
Yeah.
And in that particular year, Don Dunstan, the leader of the opposition in our state parliament, was there and presented the trophies. I mentioned this to you the other day.
Yes.
We don't have top politicians all that often at our bodybuilding shows presenting awards, not these days. And then the next year, Don Dunstan was the state premier of South Australia, and it was a position he held for many years.
That's correct. Yeah. He went on to be one of South Australia's most popular premiers.
He did.
Yeah.
He was very popular, and he brought in a number of reforms. I think he was behind the Festival Theatre being built.
That's
so
right.
there were some wonderful things he did. And you asked me the other day, was there much publicity for bodybuilding? Well, there was. The advertiser came to the place where I worked at the time on the first morning after the event, which was Monday morning, and they arranged with me that in the lunchtime I'd go up on the roof of the building and pose for photos, which then appeared in the paper, in the advertiser, with a little story probably the next day. And that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore.
No.
But the press were vitally interested in bodybuilding back then. They treated it very thoughtfully and in a positive manner, and that's how it used to be. And they came to a lot of the contests. Sometimes they'd have a photographer, or sometimes they'd just make a report. But that's something that I remember very well from those
that was
days.
the same with my shows. My first shows back in the early 2000s, there was always usually a TV crew there filming for the news the next day, and even I had reporters. But that's sadly now and I think we can talk about that later. How bodybuilding has evolved and now into a more of a freak show thing that media thinks is a joke. Whereas back then it was genuinely interesting news.
Yeah.
Tell me, back then, we'll just quickly touch on what was the training like, and what was the bodybuilding information like? Like, we're overload now with so much information.
Yeah.
How did you learn about bodybuilding? How did you know how to train and things like that? And most of all, I'd like to know, and our listeners would, and we'll touch on this only just briefly, were the drugs around, or was everyone natural back then?
I'd say pretty well natural. I never heard much talk of drugs in my days, because this was the 60s. And particularly the early 60s when I started, I would say we were pretty much on a level playing field, and genetics pretty much determined the winners, along with hard work. So I used to train 6 days a week, and I can remember even in the lunch break I had, because I worked in an office in the city, I'd go round to McNally's gym and I'd train calves in my lunch break, and then I'd go back to the gym and I'd train more at night, and I would do cardio work in the mornings. So probably...
You generally worked harder than people do these days.
I was going to say that I thought we probably trained as hard as they do these days. We didn't have any chemical assistance. Steroid injections were unheard of in my time.
Yeah.
I remember there were a few people right at the end of my career when I was retiring, because I finished in 1968. There was mention of people having a couple of Dianabol tablets a day, and that's the only talk I ever heard of steroids in my career years.
Yeah.
So it was pretty clean, pretty healthy, and a lot of hard work. We got our information from magazines such as Iron Man magazine, and by talking to people in the gym who had more experience than we did.
Did you diet down for a comp, or did you stay in sort of good condition? But yeah,
I used to try and stay fairly close to my competition weight all the time, and yes, I would diet down somewhat, but we never achieved the type of condition and definition you see today. I think people are smarter, more intelligent with their training. Perhaps supplements help, and of course we know that in some federations that the steroids also help get extreme condition that some people are able to display, and we never ever saw extreme condition when I was competing.
Yeah. So none of the single digit body fats and vascularity that competitors have these days.
I would doubt it. In fact, we didn't have striated glutes back then.
No.
So we were lean as we could in a healthy way. And off season everybody did put on a little bit of weight, but not a huge amount. And I remember a few of the bodybuilders who did bulk up, they could never get it down in time for the next contest. So that's how it used to be. It was a balancing act. And I used to do
that does happen these days as well.
Still the same.
Yes. Sometimes they don't make it back on stage enough. Yeah.
It's an ongoing problem of how early to start dieting for a contest. I also did powerlifting for heavy training for say 6 months of the year between the Mr South Australia contests each year, and I enjoyed powerlifting, and I competed in that for a period of time from early 60s up until about 1970.
Yeah. Moving then along, you're now renowned for recording most of the major shows around the contests around the world. You've got records of the Mr Universe right back to the 70s. How did all of that start? What made you turn around and start, well, I'm going to start filming bodybuilding contests? Or did somebody ask you? How did that all come about?
It came about like this. In 1970, and I knew that my bodybuilding career was over. I'd achieved all that I thought I could achieve back from 1968, and I was just doing powerlifting in 69 and 70, and I was a great fan. I knew that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to do his last NABBA Universe in London, and so I used that as a goal to get myself to London to see him in this last Universe. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, and I'm going to have a holiday afterwards, I want to shoot film of my holiday, film of Arnold, film of the Universe. So I went out and I bought a Super 8 camera, and I had hired one back in 1968 when I shot some film of my friends in the gym, but I didn't own the camera. So got the Super 8 camera, went over to London with my wife, we went to the Universe, and I started to film at the show.
Yeah.
The prejudging, I can remember it wasn't.
So did you just walk in and start filming?
Well, I almost. I bought my tickets. I went to the prejudging, and I can remember standing on a chair, because back then prejudging wasn't an audience event as such. You could go to it. It was during the afternoon. It was Friday, because the show would be Saturday afternoon, so the judging was Friday. And you stood on chairs to get a better view over the judges and people in front of you. And so I did that, and I took a few photographs, and I had my ticket for the show the next day. And then I became aware that you weren't allowed to film. I think you know where this story's going. So I hid my camera in a brown paper bag to get it into the theatre, because they had ushers in there going up and down the aisles of the theatre to make sure that nobody was filming or taking photographs only the couple of official photographers at the front were allowed to photograph. So every time when the usher would walk away from me, I could get my camera out and up I'd go and I'd start shooting this film. And luckily, their eyes, that is the ushers or the security guards, they were watching Arnold when he was on stage. They weren't watching us in the audience, so that was just perfect. So I got some great footage of Arnold and Frank Zane and all the other top competitors, and then popped the camera back in my paper bag each time when they would come towards me. So afterwards, probably the next year or after the event, I told the promoter, Oscar Heidenstam, what I'd done, and he wasn't at all upset. And in fact, he invited me to come back and keep doing it every year for them as the official film man or videographer of their event, and that's how it got started.
So that was basically the start of GMV video?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yes, before that it had just been GMV photography.
Yeah. But
the GMV filming and video came later when film was replaced by video, round about the end of 1982. So then Oscar Heidenstam very kindly said to me, look, you've got this position for as long as you want to have it. So I then continued to go back to the NABBA Universe every year, and that continued through for 40 years.
Yeah.
Up until 2010, which was my last one. And at that time then they decided in England that they wanted to use a British company, another company who had said that they would do every single NABBA show, including area shows, all over England, and I certainly couldn't compete with that, and quite rightly they took over the position of doing the filming or the videotaping of the NABBA Universe.
Yeah. Tell me, what impact did Arnold make on you? Was that the first time you saw Arnold in the flesh?
Yes, he made a huge impact. I'd never seen anybody as good as Arnold. In fact, I'd only ever seen one other famous bodybuilder, Dave Draper.
Yeah.
Because after Dave Draper, it was a few years before other star bodybuilders started to tour Australia. And that was some years later, so we'll chat about some of those famous names in a moment, but I'd never seen anybody like Arnold, and he was literally like a bodybuilder from another planet. And in the lineup where he beat Dave Draper and Reg Park, no disrespect to them, but they weren't even close. He was that far ahead of them with his total physique. Dave Draper had a great upper body, but his legs weren't equal to his upper body. Reg Park had been a fantastic bodybuilder, but he was starting to go down the other side a little bit. He just wasn't as impressive as he used to be. And Arnold was just absolutely in a different class, a class on his own. So that was an absolute revelation. And then Frank Zane won the overall amateur that day, and he won it with just symmetry, nice condition and incredible posing.
Yeah.
And his wife took out the bikini contest, which was roughly speaking between a bikini and a figure class, probably closer to the bikini class that we know of today.
Yeah. Someone told me, I heard that the women's class at the Universe show back then was just brought on as a little bit of titillation and a bit of a break from all the male bodies. I don't know, would you agree to that?
Yeah. I would agree to a certain degree, that's correct. It was, whether it was just something that was given to the women just to say, look, you've got a small part in the show. It was also to encourage women that did work out, that they had somewhere they could compete, but they weren't really competing in a muscular sense. They were competing in a conditioning and a nice balanced looking body type of contest. So it wasn't really a true figure contest, and it wasn't bodybuilding. It was a conditioned contest, and good looks helped. So it was looks, shape, condition, having a nice look, a sort of a conditioned model look. That was what they were going for.
Yeah. And
that's how the contest remained up until the 1980s, and then in 1986 in the Universe, they had a physique class for women as well as figure. So prior to that it was figure only with the Universe, and then in '86 they had women's physique. And I remember well, Monica Steiner from Germany won the first women's physique or women's bodybuilding class, and she was the beginning of the look where the women started to get, you know, really big and muscular. And so there was a good division between the physique and the figure class in bodybuilding in general.
That's right. Yeah.
And in 1983, South Australia in Sabah had their first female winner.
I was just going to ask, so when did that come in?
Yeah, it was a figure contest and it was won by Helen Maynard.
I remember her.
Yes. And that was
so that I was actually training back then, and I'd been to a few shows.
That was '83. Yeah. Yes. So she was the first one, and then talking about women in South Australia in bodybuilding, then we had Terry Roberts and Lisa Egan.
Yes.
And Terry Roberts won her class at the NABBA Universe, and Lisa Egan won an overall women's bodybuilding title in the NABBA Worlds.
That's right. Yes.
And so she had a fantastic career, fairly short career.
It was very short. I can remember Lisa when she competed here, and I could imagine that the impact Lisa made on stage would have been the same as what Arnold made back in the 70s. Because when she came on stage, I can remember at the show, there wasn't even clapping really. It was like everyone was just stunned silence.
Yes, she was big, impressive. She had good symmetry, and we made a video with her at her peak before she retired.
Yeah.
Which was lucky because there's not a big record of her career, whereas Terry Roberts has left a wonderful record behind, and that is in South Australian contests, national contests. She's been a national champion several times, as I said, at the Universe and also at the NABBA Worlds. And I'm pretty sure she won her class at the NABBA Worlds, but winning her class in the figure class at the Universe was a huge achievement, because very few Australian women have won their class at the NABBA Universe.
Right, yeah.
And Pina Theodoridis, which is Graham Lansfield's wife, comes to mind. And she won it twice, and she won the overall figure at the Universe in 1996 and 98.
Yeah. Who would you rate as one of South Australia's best bodybuilders, men's bodybuilders?
I'd immediately go for Nick Jones.
Yeah.
Because he did it in the more recent years when there was a lot of competition up against him, a lot of good competition. Go back a couple of years, you've got Mike Buda, and he won the South Australia. I see here he won it a number of times. It might have been three or four.
Mike and I competed in the first show together.
That's amazing.
In 1987.
Yes.
I can remember I was at it was at the Dompolsky Centre.
Yeah.
And I was in men's novice. They had different classes by now.
Yeah.
And it was my first contest, and we all had to come to the registration in the morning of the show, basically.
Yeah.
And they called, I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot of bodybuilders here, it's going to be a big show.
Yeah.
And then they called out the men's novice, and everyone stood up. There was like you, when you competed, I think there was about 19 in that contest. And that was Mike Buda came second in that.
That's right.
Colin McLean came third, and the winner was...
Eugene.
No.
According to the records.
Oh, is it?
No, I'm only talking about the overall South Australia.
Eugene most probably won the overall, but the novice was one. He was a police officer, and he went on to win an Australian title. Oh, the name
was Steve Taylor.
Steve Taylor.
Yeah, big
so
arms.
Steve Taylor,
Yeah.
Michael Buda, and Colin McLean were the top three.
Yeah.
Colin trained at my gym, so I knew Colin quite well, and so did Mike. So.
Well, that's good you mentioned them, because in the next year, Steve Taylor won the South Australia.
That's right.
And he also went on and he competed for Australia at the NABBA Universe, which tells me he probably won at the Australia to get himself to the Universe.
Yeah.
And Mike Buda had to wait till '89 to get his first South Australian title. So Mike Buda won '89 and '90, and then he won again in '93. So he had a pretty good run. But when you ask me who's the best South Australian bodybuilder, I should also bracket with Nick Jones to talk about my poor old friend John Kazura.
Yeah, I was just going to say John would have been right up there.
John was up there. He was in the early days of bodybuilding. As a matter of fact, in my last year competing in '68, John was coming up as an outstanding teenager, and I thought to myself, I'm glad I'm not competing against this guy because he's going to be a real champion. And then a few years later, John Kazura won his first state Mr South Australia title in 1971. He won it 10 times.
10 times?
10 times he won the title. His last one was in 1982, shortly before he died in a security van accident.
It was a tragic accident,
And
yeah.
I would say the accident was around about October because his funeral...
What year was this?
82.
82,
His
yeah.
funeral
I
was,
never saw John compete. I came on the scene a couple of years after that, but everyone still spoke about him. Yeah.
Well, he was a fantastic physique. His funeral was on the day of the football grand final, so that's how I can place it as around about October of 82, and he would have won his final Mr South Australia probably about September of 82. And he told me once, he said, people ask me, why do you keep on competing and winning? Why don't you let somebody else win the title? And he said to me, well, I figure it this way. Somebody needs to be good enough to come along and knock me off, and then they deserve the title. And that was his philosophy. He didn't say, oh, I've won it a few times, let's do something else. He said, somebody has to come up and knock me off to beat me. And that was an unusual philosophy, because not many people just keep winning the same title over and over because they have the pride in winning that title.
That's right.
So the reason I don't rate him as South Australia's greatest ever physique, he didn't have so much success nationally and internationally as, say, did Nick Jones. And I'm just going to use Nick as an example. Nick did really well at the Universe. He was unfortunate in one year where he got second by about a point in his class. He won the NABBA Worlds in his class, and he won 2 overall Australias in 2000 and 2002. And so I do rate his achievements against absolutely top-class opposition as a little bit superior to the wonderful record of John Kazura, who very much, his record was based in South Australia.
Did John compete in national titles?
Yes, he did. He competed in the Best of Australia at the 1980 Olympia in the Opera House. He was in that contest. I think he might have been, John to really won it, and I think John might have been third. I have got the information on that on my site, and it's hard to remember every placing. I think he was third. He also competed for the IFBB in the contest in the Philippines, the Universe contest, which I believe was 1981. He didn't go close to winning his class, and I think he might have competed in the IFBB overseas, maybe in Egypt or some other country. Because then, as I said, he passed away in '82. So he had reasonable success outside of South Australia, but not as much success as Nick Jones.
One more name that you brought up, we'll just quickly touch on, and that was Eugene.
Yes.
I can remember Eugene, and he was a sensation because he was just a teenager, wasn't he?
He was a kid.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he went through and won the overalls and...
Yes. Well, he won the South Australia in 1985, and then in '87 he did it again, and he won a national title, and he competed at a NABBA Universe, and he was in the NABBA Worlds held in Geelong, which I think was around about 1990 or thereabouts. He had huge potential, and I feel that if he'd stayed focused, he could have even achieved greater things. He had very good shape, symmetry, and he was a young champion, and then he took it into his 20s, and then he sort of disappeared off the scene. But he was a great bodybuilder, and I can remember him as a teenager. He'd come into me at the fitness warehouse and he'd ask me about training, and I would try and help him with his questions and with his enthusiasm, and he was a delight to work with.
Yeah. Because when he won his first title, he was only 16 or something, wasn't he?
He was very young.
Yeah.
He could have been as young as 16 or 17, and that's why I saw his potential. I thought if he can keep going and stay focused, he could be an absolute champion.
Do you think that's an issue? We see so many times really young champions and then they fall away. Did they maybe have too much success too young?
I think it was partly that.
Yeah.
And I think it was partly to the grind of all the things you have to give up to remain a champion. The sacrifices may have become too great.
Yeah.
And it had his early success, but it's very hard to maintain that for year after year and continue, say, from a teenage champion up into your 30s. I can't think of many bodybuilders that have had that combination.
No. He's got a successful personal training business in Hawaii, I believe.
Yes.
He's been there for a long time.
Yes, I heard that. And another one with a successful training business overseas is Gennaro Ferrer.
Yes, and he's still around. I see him. He posts on Facebook and social media every day.
Yes, last night I sent him his footage for his social media of his appearance in the 1989 NABBA Universe.
He put up that image this morning.
You saw it.
I saw it this morning, yes.
And we prepared that for him yesterday. Yeah. And he's been a friend of mine since 1989. We keep in regular contact. And I last saw him at a WFF contest in France. Would have been around about 2016.
Yeah.
And he's still in great shape, and he's a personal trainer in New York.
Yeah. You've been to a lot of Mr Olympia contests. Do you have a favourite?
Well, it would be one of the years when Ronnie Colman won. I'd have to say that would be my favourite Olympia. The 1980 Olympia, when Arnold won his last one, that's had a lot of bad publicity.
Well, let's talk about that now that you brought that up. There's been a lot of bad publicity, but I did listen to one of John Hanson's interviews, and there was a Aussie gentleman.
Not John Torelli.
John Torelli, and he said the decision was perfectly fair and justified. What do you think?
Well, I don't disagree with John, because it came down to this. The last three men standing. Okay, you had Arnold, Chris Dickerson, and I believe it was Frank Zane.
Yes. And
then fourth was Boyako and fifth was Mike Mensa. Who do you think then is more the Mr Olympia, Chris Dickerson or Arnold?
Who do I think?
Yeah, who would you think is the typical Mr Olympia?
Well, Arnold.
Yeah, of course. And in a close decision, and it was reasonably close. Chris Dickerson was in great shape that day, but this is where I feel that Chris Dickerson lost it and didn't take the title, and forget all the other politics. I compared body parts. Chris Dickerson had the better legs. His midsection was okay, but it was not sensational. Arnold had good abs. Arnold had by far the better upper body, and his arms were still pretty incredible. And with Chris Dickerson, arms would not be his best body part. His best feature was his overall symmetry and condition, but he wasn't noted for big arms. And Arnold was noted for having pretty substantial and impressive arms. So weighing up the different body parts and then tossing in charisma and the other little things which influence judges, I wasn't in the slightest bit surprised with Arnold winning that contest. I was mildly surprised that Mike Mensa didn't place a bit higher.
Yeah.
He got fifth, and then you'd have to say, well, who would you put him above? I would possibly have had him up at second or third.
Okay.
But he had this feud with Arnold. It didn't go well. That may have been an influence with the judges. It's hard to say. But anyway, I wasn't unhappy with Arnold as the winner of the 1980 Olympia. Chris Dickerson's a great champion, but you can't really put him alongside Arnold and say the two of them are virtually equal, because that's just not actually correct. But on the day, Arnold was a narrow winner based on the reasons that I said, that overall I think he had more things going for him, in shape, in symmetry, in every other aspect of the contest, and he was given the overall title. There was a lot of dissent from the audience. Maybe,
so the boo fest did happen?
The booing did happen.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why there was so much booing, because Arnold was popular.
Well, that's right. He just finished a $100 million box office movie and
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
I think the only reason I can put down for the booing taking place was that people probably felt that Arnold had been out of it for 5 years, and perhaps they felt that he wasn't serving his dues, and here he comes back in and he goes back on stage and he takes the title, whereas Chris Dickerson had been competing year in and year out with NABBA and other organisations, and it was a different lead up. But Arnold had this unique lead up where he suddenly appeared and he was in the contest, and I think that pissed off a few people. I'm not sure exactly why, because it was a promoter's dream to have Arnold coming back and being in the contest, but surprisingly there was some booing. Presumably I think a lot of it was from the fans of the guys that placed below first. So it was just a strange thing, because I've hardly ever heard booing at an Olympia.
Yeah.
It's fairly, in fact it's very rare. I can't remember any similar incident in the 2000s of that sort of reaction to the winner of the Olympia.
That show spurred or had my favourite video, which was the comeback.
Yes.
And I played that video until I think it broke.
Yeah.
But what I found so inspirational in that video was Frank Zane's posing routine,
Yes.
which I thought was amazing,
It was.
and Tom Platz's posing routine,
Yeah.
because there was a couple of shots where it was on his face and you could see he was putting every single fibre of his being into it.
Yes.
And the opposite was, then they showed Frank's posing and it was so graceful, so perfect,
Yeah.
so effortless.
Yeah. It was structured, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he hit every note to perfection on
Yeah.
that music. It was just, and I just kept playing it. I can remember my mum telling me to turn it off because I was
Yeah.
just kept playing it all the time.
Yeah. Well, it's a very popular DVD, and I get asked about it regularly.
Do you
today.
still sell it?
I've got a couple of copies left, but technically it's off the market.
Oh, can I have one?
We'll sort it
Because
out.
I haven't got the video
Yeah.
anymore, and it's still to this day I think about it. That video, it was entertaining. You know, it had showed all of Arnold's charisma and everything, and touched on the feuds and yeah.
Well, I had nothing to do with the original production because I shot my own version of the contest entirely front of stage.
Yeah.
The comeback was a documentary. It was behind the scenes. It was lead up. It was all sorts of things. Pump room or backstage, and of course contest. And it was produced by Kit Lachlan.
Oh, right.
And he and Paul Graham got together to orchestrate this production, and then it ended up later on the property of Kit Lachlan.
Yeah.
And he came to me some years ago, and we came to an agreement whereby I remastered it into a DVD and modernised it a little bit, added a few things, did a new cover, worked from the original film to make it the best possible quality. And the other thing I was instructed to do, I had to drop out the copyright music.
Well, that now reminds me, because I've seen different versions of that, and the music, except to Frank Zane's, changed.
Well, several pieces of music changed.
Which really disappointed me, because it was
Yeah.
the music that made his routine, I think, so good.
Well, I'll tell you why the music changed. When it ran out of copyright, the copyright owners of the music all insisted on a very high fee, which wasn't a realistic fee to be paid by the producer, who at this stage had sales which were only a trickle. Because we're now talking some years after the copyright had run out. But the producers wanted a very high figure. And so Kit Lachlan said to me, look, Wayne, you're going to have to take out their music so we can stay legal and put in copyright-free music, which I did over routines, and I think it was over the opening as well. I think the group was called the Trogs, that had played the opening music in the beginning of the video. It had a particular beat, you'll remember if you hear it again. But sadly that all had to go, and so I took that out, remastered it, and then I continued to sell it for Kit Lachlan, and he got his royalty, whatever the arrangement was. And then after some years, Kit sold the ownership of the video or DVD to a company in Canada.
Yeah.
And then it's a little bit vague as to what happened from there. The rumour was that that maybe Arnold had bought the DVD rights from the Canadians. I don't know if this is true or not, or there may have been some other situation, but it went off the market. And so when my last copy is sold, that's it. The last copy is sold because it's presently not being officially advertised for sale, and I'm not really sure what's happened. So that's the story of the comeback. With the Pumping Iron video, I understand that Arnold now owns all that footage.
I had heard that too, but it is confirmed he does own it.
I've heard that from good sources, so I'm sure that's correct. And so that's where I think there's a possibility that Arnold may now own the comeback, but I really don't know for sure. And when I had a little chat with Arnold in Columbus a few weeks ago, that was the very last question from my mind, because we did talk very briefly about 1970 and 1971, which were contests that I filmed him on film from the Universe and the Olympia in Paris, but that was all the time we had to chat about. And then he went and did an interview with Toni Doherty, and this was backstage in Columbus back in March, just a month or two ago.
How many times have you met Arnold?
Only a couple.
Yeah.
I've stood by his shoulder in Columbus backstage a couple of times waiting to speak to him when he's been speaking to dignitaries, and then the moment that he stops speaking, his bodyguards whisk him away and you don't get a chance to say hello, how you going, because that's how it is with Arnold. He's a big star, he's a former governor, and you just cannot casually have a conversation with him. It's just not possible. So I've stood close to him on a number of occasions. I did have a couple of words with him in South Africa at the Arnold last year, and then this year in Columbus, thanks to Bob Lorimer, because Bob reminded Arnold that I was the guy that had filmed him in 70 and 71. So when he came into the pump room, Arnold just came straight up to me, and we had a few words, and Toni Doherty took a photo of us talking, and that was a very nice experience.
Yeah. I got a story about Arnold. There's a guy in my gym who's a bodybuilding tragic, old school bodybuilding tragic, and he's got a belt. And every year he goes to the Arnold Classic and he gets the pros to sign it.
Yeah.
So last year he thought that I'm going to try and get Arnold's signature. And he followed Arnold around the whole venue everywhere, couldn't get anywhere near him.
Yeah.
And on the last day, he was standing in line, and Arnold was coming out of a seminar, and he saw just a couple of meters down was a kid in a wheelchair, and he thought there's a good chance Arnold's going to stop and talk to this kid in the wheelchair. So he went and stood next to this kid, and sure enough, Arnold stopped and started chatting with the little boy in the wheelchair. And when he finished, this gentleman passed his belt over and said, "Arnold, would you sign my belt?" And a security guard went along and said, "No, Arnold doesn't sign anything." And then Arnold looked at the belt and said, "Is that Ronnie Colman?" And he's going, "Yeah." And he picked up the belt and looked at all the signatures and reached behind, and someone handed him a pen and he signed it and gave it off and walked off.
Well, that's a very nice story. It's a rare story, because Arnold has so many people pulling at him wanting things that he can't possibly do everything.
But I thought it was good strategy, seeing the wheelchair.
That was good. Good strategy. A very good story.
We spoke a little bit before we started recording about how bodybuilding has changed and how social media has changed bodybuilding. Back in the 80s and 90s, even up to the early 2000s, before social media made an impact, all these bodybuilders it was rare to see a pro bodybuilder.
It was.
You know, and if there was anyone came for seminars or guest postings, the venue was usually sold out.
Yes.
But we've had a great list of great guest posers here, and I can remember going to a number of them, and the people that were at these venues were huge.
They were. They would pack out the venues. I remember Sam Raptopoulos had many stars come, and he'd have them in a special area upstairs. I think it was at his gym.
It was at his gym. He had a big empty room upstairs.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we would be packed in there. And do you remember seminars up there, for example, with Tom Platz and Rachel McLeish?
Yes.
I'm talking different years, but they were two that stick in my mind as a couple of the best ever.
Yeah. Lee Haney
Yes.
was at the Hilton Hotel.
That's right.
I can remember going there, and I spoke to Lee after the seminar, and I asked him, I'm there, Lee, what advice can you give me? And he asked, how do you train? I said, I train 6 days a week, two hours a day.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he goes, Jesus, you train more than me. Slow down. And he walked off.
Yeah. I remember that one at the Hilton very well. That was probably in the late 80s or early 90s, maybe 90s.
Yeah.
But yes, I remember that one well because he was here in association, I think, with Nutrilife.
Yeah.
Because I can remember the Nutrilife guys from Sydney were all there at the same time. But just let me run by you a few of the names of the great people we've had here in South Australia. I'll mainly concentrate on the overseas names. So there was Dave Draper, we talked about, Brian Buchanan, who had that incredible
waist.
Waist.
Yeah. And
I actually interviewed Brian on stage because that year I was paying somebody else to do the video camera for me. So I interviewed Brian. That was in Dompolsky.
At a SABA contest?
Yes, a SABA contest. We had Lance Dreyer.
Yes.
Again,
I remember seeing Lance Dreyer.
That was a SABA contest. We had, this was in early years, we had Beth Lopez, who was the best female bodybuilder in Australia. That was in the 80s. We had Matt Mendenhall give a seminar in posing. And I approached Matt and I said, can I pay you to film the seminar? I'll pay you a reasonable fee. And he said, well, I prefer that you didn't because I'm probably going to say some things about Joe Weider and I don't want to get sued. And so he said it might be best if it's not recorded. So I went to the seminar and very sadly it was a lost opportunity because there was not one question where he talked about Joe Weider.
Okay.
And that was such a lost opportunity, and I've always remembered that and thought
that was back in the days when Matt Mendenhall was one of the best bodybuilders to never become a pro.
Exactly.
And
right.
back in those days there were so many American amateur bodybuilders who were just as big as the pros. I can remember the Rory Leidelheimers and Matt Mendenhalls never won a pro card, but they were featured in magazines and travelled the world guest posing.
And they were runners up.
Yeah.
But the reason they never became pros was that they gave out so few pro cards.
That's right.
It was so tightly controlled. There'd be, say, one pro card a year for the men from their national championships.
Yeah, and it was just the overall winner, and that was it.
That was it. And time after time, Matt Mendenhall and Roy Littlemeyer got runner-up, and each year the magazines had said, oh, he'll come back next year and win it, and somebody fantastic would put them at the post again the next year, and it happened time after time.
But back then we used to know all of these amateurs. I wouldn't be able to tell you who won the US amateurs last year.
No, I couldn't either.
No.
Because those days they got mass publicity in the magazines, and they were heroes to us, even if they just missed out.
That's right.
And everybody knew Rory Littlemeyer and that funny spelling of his name, and the wonderful physique he had, and the charisma he had. I met him a couple of times, and I said to him, we've got to do a film together. And he said, yes, when I'm in shape. Well, our paths never crossed at the right moment. And so I knew him to chat. We never had worked with a camera together. So that was another lost opportunity, because I was only in California, say, in summer, and he was never at his peak at that time because that was not when he was competing. Then in Adelaide we had Richie Beretta. He guest posed, I think it was a Gold's Classic, and he was a top AAU guy, probably Mr America. We had Serge Newbray.
Yes, I can remember when Serge was here, but I couldn't get to go see him for some reason, and I was really upset. Yeah.
And that was an interesting seminar, and halfway through it he said, I'm going to finish the seminar in the gym. It must have been Sam's gym. So he said, I'll go down and demonstrate exercises as to how I train. So the last half of the seminar, we all got round in circles between every piece of equipment and we watched him train, and he explained it. And he also was not keen for me to film it because he was going to say controversial things. But again, I don't think anything controversial happened. Then we've had John Torilli guest post, and I remember because I picked him up at the airport and took him to his hotel. I remember that one very clearly. Jeff King, around about 84.
He did a seminar on Green Hill Road.
That's
in
right.
some office.
Yes, it was the top floor of the Sportsmen's Association.
I went to that seminar, and what I can remember out of that seminar was that he spoke a lot about drugs, and I had no idea. And I'm going, what's he talking about?
Yeah.
Like, that's how it still wasn't that out there even back then, that
Yeah.
I was so naive to the fact that these guys took anything. But he spoke a lot about drugs in his seminar, and I was a little bit disappointed because he's talking about all this stuff that I had no understanding of, and he wasn't talking much on training and nutrition.
Yeah, well, you know, it's really funny because, again, I introduced him for that seminar, and I had a paid cameraman filming it for me. And my recollection of him was not just of him talking about steroids. I can remember him talking about dedication and, you know, all the things that you want people to talk about, and training and never giving up. And he had won the '83 NABBA Universe, and he was one of the best. I would put him in one of the best ever NABBA Universe amateur winners.
Yeah.
When he won it that year, he was just sensational. And then he must have been here in Adelaide probably '84. It wasn't too long after his victory in the NABBA Universe, but he was very good. We took him out to dinner after the seminar that night, and I got to know him a little bit better. And then you've mentioned Lee Haney. We had Corey Everson here, and I did a contract with Corey Everson and Jeff, and worked with them for a couple of days, filming them and making a couple of different videos, which became DVDs. And she was very nice to work with. And we took her to Cleveland, where she was able to meet and interact with kangaroos and koalas, because she was a huge animal fan.
Yeah.
And she just loved that day, so that was a good time. Tom Platts may have come to Adelaide twice. He did a lot of touring, so I remember him, as she said, at Sam's gym. And then Ian Harrison came here with Lee Labrada and Sammy Ioannidis in 1990.
Yes, I can remember that.
And I asked Sam if I could film that particular night, and he'd had instructions that I was not to film it because I was closely associated with NABBA. So that was a lost opportunity that didn't get filmed. So that one slipped through the cracks. And a couple of months ago, I went and paid a surprise visit to Ian Harrison, and his jaw dropped when I walked into his gym, because I knew I was going to be there and I wanted to surprise him, and I hadn't seen him since the English Grand Prix of 1993. So I walked in there and I introduced myself, and he had to sit down. So then I had my camera with me, and we went in his office and we talked about the early days and the days when he competed. And I got a wonderful interview with him, and then he invited me out to his home, and I went out there a couple of days later and had another good time with him and his wife. So that was Ian Harrison, and his gym was in Bradenton, Florida. So we're going to keep in touch much more frequently. Bob Paris came here, and I think he posed in the Adelaide Town Hall.
Yes, I think he did.
That?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think Corey might have posed at the same event, and Tony Pearson.
Yep.
Rich Gaspari gave a seminar imposing in the Adelaide Town Hall, and I videotaped that. Charles Claremont, he guest posed here in Adelaide. He did live in Australia for about 6 months.
I can remember that guest pose, yes.
Ronnie Colman, this is jumping out of order, but Ronnie Colman came to Adelaide, and Tina and I put him on in a seminar for the Fitness Warehouse.
Yes, I was there.
And that was packed out, because I can remember we turned people away. And he posed and did a great seminar after he'd been in Melbourne, where he did a workout video.
I went out to dinner with Ronnie that night.
Oh, that would have been...
That was at the Hilton Hotel.
That would have been a nice...
And I can remember we were walking into the restaurant, and into the restaurant at the Hilton, there's maybe a set of stairs, maybe 6 or 7 stairs.
Right,
yeah, and he's looking around saying, is there a ramp? I need a ramp. And then he went all the way around so he could go up to the ramp.
Yeah, he was exhausted. He was exhausted, I would say.
But he was in phenomenal condition. He was like virtually stage condition.
He was, because he'd just been doing appearances in Melbourne for Toni Doherty, and of course I'd spent 2 days in Melbourne filming his workout, and then he did the legs part of his workout here in Adelaide. I think it was done at the gym where Jason Bednar's was.
Yes. I got a story. When we were out to dinner that night, they ordered the food. Waiter came to order the food, and he said, "Right, listen carefully." And he said, "I would like a big bowl of rice delivered out first as my entree. Just plain white rice, no sauce, nothing on it, just steamed rice.
Right.
Then I would like that followed up with, I think he said like a 12-ounce steak
Yeah.
with nothing on the plate, no sauce,
Yeah.
no condiments, just the steak."
Right.
So the rice came out and that was fine, and he ate all that.
Yeah.
And then when the steak came, the chef had seen it upon himself to put some sort of sauce on it because it was so bare and bland.
Yeah.
And he told the waiter, he said, "I told you no sauce." And the waiter was standing there, and they have, they have their little white towels over their arm.
Yeah.
Ronnie grabbed his little white towel or napkin,
Mm-hmm.
folded the steak into this napkin, pressing on both sides until all the sauce was sopped up, and then put his steak back on the plate and gave the waitress her little napkin back.
Good story. Yeah.
And then proceeded to eat the steak.
Because I heard him order at a meal in Melbourne, and he said similar things. He said, "I want it just straight, bland, nothing on it, nothing done to it, no salt, nothing." And they couldn't believe it because nobody else asks for food like that.
That's right.
But that's how he was.
Yeah.
And this time that I'm talking about in Australia, I think it was just after he won his final Olympia title.
I think it was too,
Yes,
yeah.
I think the next year he then lost to Joe Cutler.
Yeah.
So
And you're right, that video was filmed at the Powerhouse gym when Jason was running it.
That's the yes. His legs workout was done there, and the rest of it was shot at Toni Doherty's gym over 2 days.
Yeah.
And we had quite a crew. We had 2 video cameras, a photographer, an interviewer. Toni Doherty did the interviewing. So a couple more people that were here. I mentioned Tony Pearson. Samir Banu. Tina and I put on Samir Banu.
I went to that one as well, and I've got a signed poster that I bought off Samir that time. Yeah.
And Samir gave me a poster, and Samir also didn't want to be videotaped because he also said that he was probably going to say some things about Joe Weider because they'd had a big fallout.
Yeah.
And Samir was out of the IFBB, I believe, at that time, and he even competed in a NABBA Worlds against Charlie Claremont, where Charlie won in Geelong about 1990. So that was Samir.
He signed my poster and he made a spelling mistake, and I asked him if he could do another poster, and he just going, "Yes, but you'll have to pay for it." And I'm there, "No, well, I'll take this one." So that's still up on my gym wall, and people go, "He spelled thanks wrong."
Yeah, well, Samir, he's a unique individual. I'll leave it at that. Dorian Yates has posed here in Adelaide.
Yes.
I think it was Don Polsky.
It was at the Don Polsky Centre, and I was backstage because one of my friends was competing.
Yeah.
And I saw the guest pose, and then I ran backstage because my mate was coming on, I think. And I can remember Dorian, he came off the stage.
Yeah.
And he was so out of breath that he could barely stand. He was leaning against the wall, and I'm just staring at him in awe. And he looked up and he saw me, and he tightened everything up again and walked off into the change room.
Yeah. Well, Dorian was an absolute legend. With us in GMV, he is one of the most popular bodybuilders of all time in regards to our sales.
Yeah.
Ronnie Colman was incredibly popular too, around about that time when we made the training video with him and throughout his career. But Dorian Yates still has a huge following of fans buying his material from us, even though it was years ago that he stopped competing. Yes, yeah, he's right.
More than Ronnie?
Yes.
Yeah.
Currently more than Ronnie.
Yeah.
Yes, currently. We get people asking about Dorian Yates every week.
Right.
And that's remarkable.
One of the questions I've got down here, one of the few questions that I did write down was that, did Dorian change the sport?
Yes.
And do you think it changed it better or worse?
Well, he changed the sport. The second half of the question's a tough one.
Yeah.
A lot of the critics say he changed it not for the better, but for the mass direction.
That's right.
Which is dominating today. The Jay Cutler direction, the Ronnie Colman, the people, and Phil Heath even. These people are so big that the smaller type of physique these days doesn't ever get voted number one in contests such as Grand Prix and Olympias. So he did change it completely down the path of mass. And if you go back to before Dorian, you had people like Lee Labrada, Rich Gaspari to a degree, a whole lot of smaller type guys. Mohammed Makoui, yes. Sean Ray. A lot of these shorter, smaller guys were right up there in second place and with a chance to win. But when the mass monsters came along, it's pretty much been the end of those guys. The only smaller guy I can tell you who's won the Olympia in recent years would be Dexter Jackson. And even then he's pretty massive for his height. Yeah. So it did change the face of bodybuilding with the look that Dorian brought on after the Lee Haney years.
Yeah.
So therefore it was a good thing that the 212 class exists, because it gives the smaller type of physique, and I say smaller more in stature, people like Flex Lewis a chance to be champions, because when those guys, for example, if they win in the Open Olympia, I don't think they were placed in the top two.
Yeah.
I think the mass monsters would still be taking the top places. Whether it's for the good or not, well, it's not for me to say, but I'm pleased that there are options, because there's now a third option. There's the classic physique.
Yeah.
And I'm talking IFBB here, but other federations have got similar. So the classic physique, the 212 and the Open Mr Olympia, it gives you three areas to pick where you want to position yourself in the sport.
Yeah, that's true.
A couple more guest posers in Adelaide that we've not mentioned: Johnny Jackson, Toni Freeman. This is in more recent years.
Yeah, Johnny Jackson, when he was here, he then did an appearance at one of my shops.
Did he?
Yeah, he was there all afternoon. He was a really nice guy.
Yes. I can remember coming to your shop and photographing somebody in the shop. I don't know who that was now, whether it was Ronnie.
I think it was Ronnie.
Yeah, I think it was Ronnie.
We had Ronnie. Yeah. Remember, and the whole car park was full of people.
Yeah, that was exciting. Yeah, it was Ronnie, because I remember I could chat with him and say a few things about the last Olympia with him, because it was nice to touch base. Toni Freeman, he had a wonderful physique. He got a lot of difficult placings, I felt, where he perhaps got seconds or thirds where he could have been a bit higher. But he did win a number of pro shows.
The Michael Jackson of bodybuilding.
He was, wasn't he? And he had a trim waist, and he had a really nice shape and look. We had Paul Haslam. This is early days of Sabba. We had Don Marnie, Bronwyn O'Brien, Gary Lua.
Yeah. These
were all guest posers that came from interstate. But going right back, Bill Pearl and Dennis Tenorino guest posed here. And I'm pretty sure it was 1983. And Bill Pearl said at the time it was going to be his last public guest posing appearance. I don't think you were there that night.
No, I can remember that as well, but I wasn't there.
And that was at the Sportsmen's Association on the South Terrace in Adelaide. And the last two on my list happened to be Anita Lawrence, who was a Figure Universe winner, and last but not least Al Beckles. And we touched base briefly. I think
that was at the Olympian upstairs. Yeah.
Al Beckles put on a good seminar where you said his wife assisted him, did some of the talking.
She did a lot of talking.
And Al Beckles posed at the end of that seminar, and he was a legend. And I first met...
Was he in his 50s at the end of his career?
Yes.
He was?
I'm sure he was.
Because nobody really knows how old he was. But he was competing in the early 70s with Arnold.
I was going to say, I first paid Al Beckles to do a film for me back in 1971 in London, after a NABBA Universe, where I think he won his class. And then a week later, we all went over to Paris, and he competed in the IFBB Universe, and he won the overall.
Yeah.
But that was the same contest where Sergio Oliver was banned and not allowed to compete in the Olympia for having done the NABBA Universe the week before. So Arnold won that Olympia, virtually unopposed. There was one other competitor, an unknown guy, that was living in France, I believe, and so Arnold won that Olympia, and Sergio guest posed, and Franco Colombo was banned from that event, and he guest posed as well, and Albert Beckers won the amateur.
So politics still played a part back then as well.
Yes, it was unfortunate that in those days the IFBB really had a big thing against NABBA and didn't want their people being in NABBA and then going in an IFBB contest, and if you did, you were punished.
Yeah.
That's what happened back then. But Arnold said in Columbus in March this year, he said some words that really touched me. He said he wishes that today everybody from every federation could compete wherever they wished and just let the best man win. And if we could get back to that, or if we could get to that, I'm not sure if that's existed, not in the last perhaps 40 or so years, wouldn't that be something special? That you could please yourself where you compete.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately I don't think it'll happen.
While we're talking about South Australian bodybuilding, there was one more interesting thing I wanted to share with you that you probably don't know. In 1975, Wayne Thompson won the Mr South Australia, and he worked for South Australian Police. And I was told the other day that he's the father of Adelaide Crows football legend Scott Thompson.
Oh, really?
And did you know that?
No, I didn't.
And Scott Thompson always had a great physique as a footballer.
Yes,
and
he did.
And I'm sure he hit the weights, and he also inherited some great genetics from his dad, because his father Wayne Thompson was a very good South Australian bodybuilder, and I put that in my little known facts file. Yeah. And I only was told that very recently by somebody that knew Wayne Thompson, and what a good bodybuilder he was. So there's a quick wrap up of that. Now I know you wanted to touch on a few interesting things from the pump room at the Olympia.
Yeah, so tell me that you film the pump room. Do you still do that every year?
Yes, I do.
So what's that? You're in the backstage area as the competitors are getting ready.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's a rarefied area. It's very hard to obtain or to earn a press pass to be in that area.
Yeah.
But I do other work for the Olympia, such as filming everything that takes place on the expo stage, which is prejudging of the different professional classes, and I also now do the amateur Olympia, and so this comes with it, this privilege of being in the pump room. And so over the years I've seen up close the very best bodybuilders in the world, and when I say up close, you don't normally see people like Ronnie Colman where you're standing a metre away from them while they're pumping up or doing legs or doing something backstage. It's such a rare privilege to be that close. You see the striations that you don't see when you're sitting in the audience out the front.
So do these guys all have their own little specialised routines getting ready?
Mostly.
So I imagine as a pro bodybuilder your tan would get done for you, so there's tanning happening. And
yes, there's tanning and touching up of tanning. There are the official tanners and the official oiler uppers backstage.
Yeah.
And they're appointed, they're typically working for, well, it used to be Jan Tanner, and now it's Pro Tan from Florida. They're the official people backstage at the Olympia, and so they have their crew there, and a few of the people like to have it done in a private little area backstage. So people like Phil Heath, and I remember Kevin Levroni, they disappear, but everybody else just stands out in the side of the pump room, and they have their tan touched up, or their oiling touched up, and then they go back and do a bit more pumping, and then they're called to line up, and everybody on stage or everybody wait backstage if they're about to pose. So it's very regimented, organised, and it's just a great place to be in, and it's an experience. So I'm filming the pumping up, the oiling, the tanning, the lining up sometimes, just whatever's going on. I try and record it for posterity. Yeah. And then a year or two ago, we had Joe Weider in the pump room in a wheelchair, and he was in the last year or so of his life. Yeah. But they brought him in the pump room, and people came up and stood with him for photographs. I remember Joe Cutler for one, and others, and Joe could hardly speak because he was very frail. But people gathered around him and honoured him and respected him. It was a wonderful thing to see. And then occasionally too, Arnold will walk through the pump room and say a few words to some of the competitors, but he doesn't stay there long, because otherwise, as it is, everybody mills around him, so there's no peace for Arnold if he goes backstage. Last year, Betty Weeder was in the pump room.
Okay, Joe's wife.
Joe's widow, and she was chatting to people like Joe Cutler, and somebody else grabbed her for a little quick interview, so I got a little bit of footage of that. So there's always something fascinating, different, exciting happening in the pump room. And then of course the winners come back with their big medal around their neck, and then you can't get near them for a while because they have to do their interviews for the sponsor, the webcast, and say for the AMI, for the Weeder people. And then they come over, and people such as Toni Doherty can grab them for a little interview, and I often film that, or I can do my own interviews if I want. But people are pretty tense backstage, and so interviews aren't commonly done until the end of a class, when they come back and they're relaxed. But let me tell you about one particular year. In 2002, Sean Ray had retired from the Olympia the year before. 2001 was his last. And I booked him to be my backstage interviewer.
All right.
And so he came back and he interviewed every single competitor for me in the pump room, bar one. And that one was Paco Bautista, because he couldn't speak a word of English, from Spain. And of these competitors, there were 25 of them. So Sean Ray did 24 interviews. And I've got a note here. The strangest interview was with Dexter Jackson, and he did the interview laying on his back on the floor. He was so depleted and so tired and exhausted that they hurled the microphone over his face, and he just lay on his back to do the interview. I've never seen anything like that before. So that was something that I will not forget. And the year before, 2001, nothing to do with interviews, but Kevin Levrone was also the same in the pump room. He was in the middle of the floor, on his back, in an exhausted position, and he had one leg back. He was sort of stretching at the same time, but he looked almost as if he'd passed out. You never see that now in the pump room. People do lay down, say, in tracksuits, but these two guys were laying down with just their trunks on. But they looked like that they were so exhausted they couldn't do another thing. And so these images, I have photographs of it, and that's how I never forget. So they were a couple of things that stick in my mind. And there were 25 competitors in 2002. So that
must have been one of the biggest Olympias ever.
That was huge. So there was a lot of work for Sean Ray. And I've made a note here that one of the competitors was Bob Ciccarello.
Oh, right. Who's now the MC?
He's now MC of the Olympia. And in that particular year, 2002, Lee Priest placed 6th, which was that was the equal highest that Lee ever placed. And Lee also placed 6th in the year 2000. Now, not many Australians or people watching this will remember how good Lee was, and getting 6th in the world against mostly guys that were huge was a fantastic achievement. There was one year I really felt he deserved 5th, but of course in a close decision the American-based bodybuilder is going to get the nod, and so it was. I think it might have been Gunther Schlierkamp one year, because he'd been living in America since he went over there, and I'm pretty sure he beat Lee by one placing one particular year where I thought it could have gone either way. So there were a couple of incidents that stayed with me. And in 1999 I had to look up my facts on this one, because here's an incident I'll share with you not many people know about. Paul Dillette was struggling with dehydration, and at the end of the prejudging, or after he'd done some comparisons, he went back, he came off the stage, and I was standing backstage with my video camera, because I was shooting everything that was going on there, and he sort of collapsed to the ground, and they called the first aid guys, and they put him on a stretcher, and I'm sure it was dehydration and doing too much whatever he'd been doing, and so he passed out. And as they were taking him or putting him onto the stretcher, they said to me, one of the officials said to me, "Wayne, please don't film this."
Yeah.
And so I didn't. And I looked on the internet today, and there's no mention of this incident happening that I could find happening at the 99 Olympia. It happened at the 98 Olympia as well, but I wasn't there. So they took him away and they revived him, and then he came back later, of course, for the finals, and he placed 7th.
Yeah.
So that was Paul Dillette, and he'd had several incidents I discovered today from my research where he'd had dehydration and collapse or fainting or
there was
passing
one
out.
contest where he was carried off the stage.
Yes, I think that was 98.
Was that the Olympia stage?
Yes.
Yeah.
It said on the internet 4 men carried him off stage.
That's right, yeah.
So that had happened the year before, and I think when it happened in 1999, they didn't want it publicised because it was getting to the point where he could kill himself. If this kept on happening, something was going to happen that was really serious. So that's why I was asked to not record it or to publicise it in any way, and I didn't. And this is the first time I've told this story.
Okay.
About Paul Dillette. He competed for a couple more years. He was very good. Not quite number 1, but I think he did win 1 or 2 pro shows.
He won a couple of pro shows, yeah.
But he was always right up there in the top echelon, and he was a guy that used to push himself right to the point of collapse, to get the very best out of himself for condition at these top contests, and he suffered for it. So that was Paul Dillette.
What about, was there any rivalries, any push and shove, anything like that, or were the competitors good, you know?
The only nasty rivalry was between Kai Green and Phil Heath.
So that rivalry is real?
I believe it's absolutely real.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of gamesmanship, but it's also, I think, it's deep-seated dislike of each other. It's an attempt to use the mind to gain an advantage, which used to happen a lot in the old days. And I've seen things get really bitter at the press conference between Kai Green and Phil Heath.
Yeah.
I think I've seen it a couple of times. They were the only two that stand out that had really strong rivalry. The rivalry between Jay Cutler and Ronnie Colman was always very respectful.
Yeah.
And for years, Jay had to settle for 2nd place time after time at the Olympia. But he never acted poorly, blamed anyone. He just kept going until he won it.
Well, when we had Kai Green here, he was in Adelaide a couple of years ago, and he came and trained at my gym. And I was taking him for a tour around my gym because I've set my gym up sort of like Doherty's with lots of photos and stuff. And we've got a really big mural on the wall of Arnold, Phil Heath, and Jay. I think it is.
Yeah.
But as we were walking around, Kai Green never mentions Phil by name. He calls him the current Olympia champion. So he would go, "Oh, I see you have a mural of the current Olympia champion." And I'm there, "Yes, Phil Heath." And he goes, "Yes, the current champion." And that's all he'd say. And when he did his seminar, he said the same thing. He never mentioned Phil by name. It was just the current Olympia champion. So yeah, there obviously is something there.
Yes, there's a deep-seated difference of opinion between them. That's as nice as I can put it.
Yeah.
And as I said, I've seen it happen a couple of times. I understand that Kai probably feels that they will never let him win the Olympia. Now, the word "let him win," I know they're leading words, but I believe that he does feel that, and I think that's the reason why he stopped competing in the Olympia. He's very, very close with Phil. It comes down to a matter of which type of physique do you prefer.
Yeah.
And the judges tend to always stick with the current champion in a close decision. There's an old saying, to knock out the champion, you've got to be 10% better. Well, that's pretty hard.
That's right.
To be 10% better than Phil Heath is going to be near impossible. So unless Phil comes in 1 year and he's off, then I can see him winning it for at least another year or two, unless either injuries or some other thing brings Phil down, and it must be terribly hard to keep the motivation up to do all the things he has to do to be able to keep on winning.
Yeah.
That's the hard part. I don't see him going on for more than a year or two.
I think he wants 10.
Yes, he does. What's he got now? Seven. Yeah, 7. So he'd have to do another 3.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to push him to the absolute limit if he continues to try and get that record. Trying to think of any other big rivalries. There was a small one between Sean Ray and Dorian Yates, because I was in Finland doing their pro show a couple of years ago, and both of them were at the microphone, and Sean Ray, I think he was joint MC that year, and Dorian Yates was there as a guest, and he said to Dorian, he said, "I used to hate you when I was competing." He said, "You stopped me time after time from getting an Olympia title." And he said it with quite a degree of feeling, but in a reasonably nice way as well. But that's how he felt at the time.
Yeah.
But now all these years later, he can sort of joke about it. But I'm sure that really hurt, because he couldn't just get on top of Dorian to get one Olympia title for himself. So he brought that up, and I think they probably had quite a good rivalry back in their time. But there's no other one that springs to mind. Most of the guys backstage are extremely polite towards each other.
Yeah.
Which is good.
Yeah, that's excellent. There's another note that you wrote here on one of our notes, is that the most unique contest you did, and that was the final night of the champions in New York.
Yeah.
And you say here, when it was not IFBB.
That's correct.
I never realised that. So it was a non-federation show as such, or?
Well, it was a new federation show.
Right.
What happened was, after 2004...
so that was the 2006 Night of the Champions?
Yes, correct.
Last one?
The last one, and it was not IFBB. Well,
I never knew that.
You didn't know that?
No.
What actually happened was, there was a disagreement between Wayne Gallasch and the Weeders, and so they were in a position whereby they could relieve him of his position of promoter of the Olympia.
Right.
I'm putting that as nicely as I can, because I think that he was harshly dealt with. So he was no longer the promoter of the Olympia, and then from 2005 onwards, it's been the role of Robin Chang.
Yeah.
And he's done a great job, and he's made it bigger and better every year since. But getting back to poor old Wayne Gallasch, his position came to an end after the 2003 Olympia, and then another couple of guys did it for 2004. So Wayne was out in the cold. He was out of the IFBB, and so in 2006 he started a new association. I think it was called PBBI or something like that, Professional Bodybuilders Association. And he said, right, I'm going to restart the Night of Champions. So he did. I'd never done a contest in New York, partly because of the difficulty of being allowed to film in theatres because of the unions.
Yeah.
That's another long story. So I thought, right, here's my chance. I'll get to do a Night of Champions. It was the only one of the big contests I'd never done. And I hadn't done a contest in New York. So Wayne said, yes, I'd love to have you do the show. So I went to New York. I went there early. I stayed with Kenny Castle in New Jersey. And it was a 2-night show. The first night they had amateurs, and then the winner of that was qualified for the second night, the Saturday. And it was in the Town Hall Theatre, and I'll show you the poster downstairs. Beautiful poster. And Lee Priest was their star competitor, because Lee Priest was under suspension from the IFBB.
Right.
At this time. And there was a guy, another guy from the Middle East who was runner-up.
Now I can recall something when you start mentioning this. Yeah,
Middle East guy.
the controversy behind this contest. Yeah.
But Lee Priest was a very good winner. He was in fantastic shape and condition. And they came on with themes. And Lee Priest did a Superman thing coming out of a...
Now I remember.
You remember?
I can remember now.
Yeah, coming out with his cape out of a telephone box.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful show. Great show. And
but it was a show which Lee won quite comfortably.
Yes, he did. Yes. He was in a class of his own.
Yeah.
He won it comfortably. The others were all very good, but they weren't Olympia standard, and Lee was Olympia standard. So then they went over and they did the show in England, Night of Champions, and Lee won that as well. And then the show came to an end because the doctor, Wayne Gamaliel's doctor, told him that the stress of putting on these events was so great that he had to stop for health reasons, because Wayne's been fighting cancer for a number of years, and so he had to stop because the amount of stress was enormous in putting on such events. And in particular, you're fighting the IFBB when you're putting on a non-IFBB event.
That's right.
So that was the end of the Night of Champions, but I felt so honoured and lucky that I got to be at the very last one, and I got to film a contest in New York. And I can remember after the contest, because I had all my equipment in a great big case, like I still have today, and I was walking through the streets of New York, going back late at night back to my hotel, and it made me think of scenes from Law and Order, which we see on TV. I felt like I was somehow as an extra in a cast of Law and Order, because I had to say a half a mile walk back to the hotel, but nothing untoward happened. It was just an eerie feeling, walking around New York on your own at night with a great bag of video equipment. So, as I said, that was the most unusual contest that I can remember, because it was a one-off.
Yeah. You had nothing to do with the WBF, the Wrestling Federation that came in for a couple of years?
No, I didn't, only because they certainly didn't need any connection with me, because they had a huge television crew. They had all the wrestling cameras, they had all the links, they had all the technical backup that they needed, and it happened and came and went so quickly.
That's right.
It was all gone in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So I only saw their videos, but I never got to be anywhere near any of their events. But I believe the guys were very well paid.
Yes.
The lucky ones that got the contracts.
Yeah.
And just maybe to wrap up, I thought I'd touch on a few of the unique names from the pump rooms, names that are getting to be forgotten today. Milos Sachev.
Yeah.
Now, he's not so much forgotten because he's retired, but he did a huge number of Grand Prix in his career.
Yeah, wasn't he the most...
I think so.
The guy who did the most amount of shows.
I think he was, and it was it somewhere up around like 90?
It was something crazy, yeah.
It was phenomenal.
It was just about every pro show Milos was in.
Yes.
I can remember, yeah.
Yeah, for year after year, he did these pro shows, and I had him in so many videos, and he contacted me a year or so ago, and he bought everything that he was in from me. It was a huge box I sent him. I gave him a special price, of course, and so he has all of his career now, which he got from me. So that was rather nice. Lee Priest I've talked about, Australia's greatest ever pro bodybuilder.
Yeah.
You'd have to say that. John Torelli was outstanding, but Lee Priest did the best in the Olympias, and for a consistent career, he won Ironman Pros, San Francisco Pro, Australian Pro, so he had a fantastic career. And I don't think he gets quite enough credit in his own country for what he achieved in his career, for various reasons. Marcus Rule is another name. He had a huge cult following. Marcus Rule, people just loved him. And he had what you call the brutal physique. He wasn't a pretty guy.
No, he wasn't one of the best physiques.
No, he wasn't.
But it was impressive nonetheless.
Yeah, and he had a huge fan following, so he's worth mentioning. Of course, Flex Wheeler. Well, what more can you say about him? He's won everything except the Olympia.
He should have won the Olympia.
Quite probably. Yes, but he just didn't quite get there. Sean Ray, I've touched on him. He had a fantastic career. And Nasser El Sombati, he's been as high as second or third in the Olympia. Yeah. And he's no longer with us. There's a name that we should never forget. Dexter Jackson, well, he's still competing, and he's been competing for, who knows, 25 years
Must be.
Or more. Because if he's 48 now and he would have been competing at the top level when he was about 20, that would give him 28 years.
That's right.
Admittedly, that includes his top amateur years. So he's another absolute legend. Joe Cutler, and another absolute legend of the sport. Great guy, a wonderful physique, and he didn't ever do very much pumping up backstage.
Yeah.
He did very little pumping. He did tensions and a few tricep presses, but he was not one that hit a lot of weights backstage. And I remember Bill Pearl told me the same. Bill Pearl told me that he never used to pump up much backstage either in his competitions. Chris Cormier, he did very well, got a lot of seconds. He won some titles, some big titles, Ironman.
He won a lot of Australian pros.
Yes, and a lot of Ironman contests. He was a great physique. King Kamali is a name that's forgotten. Wonderful posing. And he used to have a feud with Craig Titus.
I was at that contest in Melbourne when they competed, and that was the most entertaining pre-judging I've ever witnessed in my life.
Yes, yes.
And the judges even brought them out together deliberately, I feel, so that they would be next to each other on stage.
Yes, I'd agree. I was there.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful feud between those two. Because they've both gone on to different pastures now, and poor old Craig Titus is serving time, and King Kamali is long retired.
Yeah.
And another name we haven't mentioned today is Vince Taylor.
Yes, one of my favourites.
Mine too.
Yeah.
His posing, I never got sick of it.
That Terminator posing routine.
Yeah.
If you ever, listeners, if you ever just YouTube Vince Taylor Terminator, and you'll see that Terminator routine. It's just really so good.
And he talked about that routine at the Arnold Classic seminar in March this year.
Oh, right.
And he said that he lived off that routine, posing all around the world for X number of years.
He did.
He said it supported him for years because everybody wanted to see it.
Yeah.
I never got sick of it.
No.
I saw it endless times in different locations, FIBO, contests, whatever, and people loved it. And I have to rate it. It's probably the most memorable posing routine.
Definitely.
It's one that just comes to mind if you say posing routines.
Yeah.
Gunter Slierkamp had a fairly short career, but there was one year at the Olympia where the crowd were all barracking for him and wanted him to win. And that might have been the year when he might have got 5th, but he did get a fairly high placing.
Well, then didn't he? Yeah, didn't he then? A couple of weeks later, he beat Ronnie.
Yes.
At a some show, I can't remember what.
It was like a Texas show or
Texas show or something. And he beat Ronnie. Yeah.
It might have been New Orleans, but somewhere down the southern states, he beat Ronnie, which proved the fact that he was very, very good.
Yeah.
And at the Olympia, where Gunther got 5th, and then he got 5th 2 years in a row, 2002, 2003, and it might have been the second time, I really thought he was going to get up there and get about a second.
Yeah.
But the judges didn't see it that way. Kevin Levrone, what a great physique.
Yeah. Also one of my favourites. I had 2 posters on my wall when I got into bodybuilding, and one it was Kevin Levrone and Rich Gaspari.
And so a quick Kevin Levrone story. He told me a few years back that when he would see me in the pump room at the Olympia, and he'd see me there every year, and he'd see me at all the pro shows and in the pump room before I'd be out the front, he said, "Wayne, when I see you in the Olympia pump room, I feel like I'm home." I thought that was a nice thing to say.
Yeah, really nice.
He said, "It makes me feel relaxed and I feel at home."
Did you bump into Kevin recently when he was here in Melbourne competing?
No, the last time I interviewed him was when he made his Olympia comeback.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah, year before last. And we had a good chat there and talked on video, and that was really good. But I haven't had a chance to talk to him since.
Yeah.
And in the shorter guys, Ahmed Haidar. Fantastic abs, again had a fairly short career, very symmetrical, that some of the best abs I've ever seen.
I can remember him.
He was a shorter guy, so he was never going to place high, but these are names of people that are forgotten, that don't deserve to be forgotten. And then there was Tommy Thorvaldsen, who used to do a backflip in his routine, and nobody does that today.
No.
A bit dangerous, but he used to do it. Time after time I saw him do it.
He was Norwegian?
Yes, I think it was from there. Yes. and Ernie Taylor with his amazing arms. And at one Olympia, they got stuck into him. I think it was at a press conference about his arms and what did he have in them.
The triceps, yeah.
And it got rather embarrassing and too personal. And I think Ernie Taylor finished his career after that.
Yeah.
Because it was starting to get quite nasty and going a bit too far. But that was Ernie Taylor, incredible arms. And then Gustavo Bedell, when he posed, when he was doing comparisons, he would stamp his foot on the stage before he would hit the pose to show strength, aggression, determination. Never seen anybody else do that.
Yeah.
He didn't just hit the pose, he'd slam his foot down on the stage and then he'd hit the compulsory pose. So there are just a few people that just come to mind that are worth mentioning who were unique. And then there's Darren Charles,
yes,
went in many Olympias, and he's now back competing again in the classic physique Olympia.
and he did quite well last year. He won a number of shows.
Yeah, he won a lot of shows, and coming into that Olympia, I felt he was probably a favourite.
Yeah.
He didn't place highly.
No.
When I say highly, he might have been 5th or 6th. Many people thought he was going to take it because of his past reputation in open competition, but the younger guys were so good in the classic class that his age went against him and he didn't get a high placing.
Yeah.
And you've got people like Michael Buendia, who's won the men's physique, I think 4 times in a row. There's talk now that he's going to go up into another class. Did you hear that?
I have heard the rumour that he's going to
classic, yes,
yeah.
and then he can show his legs to be judged on his legs.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a good move, and he's by far the best men's physique competitor I've ever seen. And in the classic physique, well, there haven't been many winners of that division yet.
Yeah.
So there's nobody that I can just say is absolutely phenomenal there. And in the 212, we must pay tribute to Flex Lewis, where he's completely unbeatable. And in the, I think it was the 90s, I filmed Flex Lewis winning the Junior NABBA Universe.
Oh, really?
And I remember at the time, when he walked out on stage at the prejudging, I said to myself, right, who's going to be 2nd, 3rd and 4th? He was that clearly a winner from the beginning of round 1, and I felt then this guy's going to have a real career. And then of course he became an IFBB champion in the 212, and there's talk that maybe one day he might go in the open class. And I heard people talking about him in Columbus, saying that if he did do that, he would need more size, and whether he wants to get more size, what effect would this have on his great symmetry?
Yeah.
It might ruin what makes him a great physique today.
That's right.
So there's a 50-50 debate as to whether people think he will go open or will he stay the 212 champion until he retires. And it's hard to think of, the word retire because he's not old.
Yeah.
But this year in the Olympia, he's going to have some competition. The guy that won the 212 in Columbus, Kamal Ilgagni, is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
And he's got a total package. He's got great symmetry, definition, good arms, good calves, great abs. I can see him at the worst being 2nd in the 212 Olympia this year. There's my prediction, at worst. If by chance Flex Lewis is not at his peak, then Kamal could be a surprise or somewhat shock winner in some people's eyes of the 212 Olympia.
This is the guy who made a comeback, wasn't he?
Yeah, made a comeback.
And he was denied a pro card for so many years
correct.
just through petty politics.
That's correct.
Yeah, I heard his story.
Yes.
And he's in his 40s.
Yes, he's in his 40s. He's won everything in NABBA. I don't think he won overall amateur. He's won NABBA Worlds. He's won his class in the NABBA amateur.
It wasn't until this split happened in the IFBB that they gave him his pro card.
That's correct.
Yeah,
That's
because Raphael?
Yeah, Raphael.
Yeah, he refused to give him his pro card.
That's the story.
Yeah.
And he did a great interview with Toni Doherty. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, I did see it.
Backstage at the Olympia. Well, I was standing there filming that.
Yeah.
And I've known Kamal since he was just starting on the scene in England, and I made 2 videos with him over the years.
Oh, right.
And I always thought that he had great potential and great ability, and now the whole world saw him in the Arnold Classic, and they saw how great he is as a bodybuilder, even though I think he said he might be in his late 40s.
Yeah, I think he is. You're right.
But he doesn't look an old man. He looks like a mature bodybuilder.
That's right.
With outstanding credentials. As I said, he's got all the different boxes from his posing, and I've talked about his physique. So I think perhaps that would be the last champion that I would be thinking of talking about from, well, he hasn't so much been in the Olympia yet, but he's won a 212 Arnold, and that's a pretty high credential to have to go into the Olympia.
There's also Hardy Chupin, but unfortunately he most probably will never be able to compete in America due to their visa restrictions with Iranian athletes.
Yes, I heard that there were athletes that weren't allowed into America.
Yeah.
I heard that affected the Arnold as well.
That's right.
This
Hardy
year.
is a phenomenal 212 competitor.
That would be a shame.
Yeah, another one that he's won a few shows outside of America, but he can't get his visa to come in.
Because we all want to see the best people on the stage.
Yeah.
We don't want politics and federations messing with the sport, and if we can see the best people on stage, and as long as they don't have some criminal history that says they shouldn't be there, all things being equal, let's have the best bodybuilders competing on stage, pick the federation, pick the class they want, and then let them have at it.
That's right. That's a great note to finish on, Wayne. Thanks for this chat. I mean, I've been just fascinated the whole time, and we could go on for hours, and maybe we should come back and just talk a little bit more, because there's so many other topics that we could still cover from your incredible career in bodybuilding. It's just been fascinating, and I'd like to thank you from the bottom of our heart for taking part.
Thank you for asking me, and maybe we can do a reprise after the Olympia, and also we probably should talk just a tiny bit more next time about the 40 years of the NABBA Universe, because we didn't go into that very deeply, partly because I've been covering that with John Hansen, but that leaves us something to talk about next time.
No, definitely. Thank you very much, Wayne, and thanks all for listening. And don't forget, guys, if you really like this podcast, just leave a review. Reviews will help us move up in the standings. And we'll catch you next time on Australian Muscle Chats 2.